Did Ferrari just get exposed from the inside? While the world focused on lap times, Lewis Jamilton was busy dismantling the myth of equality within one of the most iconic teams in Formula One history. His silent rebellion, rooted not in ego but in facts, has left fans questioning, was Leclerc ever truly the faster driver or just the better protected one? For years, the Red Garage ran on tradition, not transparency. Now, with Jamilton forcing accountability at every level, even the team's engineers can no longer hide behind strategy briefings and rehearsed statements. And the most uncomfortable truth? The performance gap was never in the car, it was in the culture. If Ferrari is finally playing fair, is Leclerc ready to win without a head start? It was just another routine afternoon inside the Ferrari simulator facility in Maranello. At least that is what the engineers thought. The hum of the simulation platform echoed through the high-tech chamber, while telemetry data scrolled down screens in real time. Lewis Jamilton, calm as ever in his racing suit, stared ahead, hands rested on the virtual wheel, absorbing every curve of the digital circuit. Nothing seemed unusual until the moment his voice cut through the radio. What he said was not technical. It was not strategic. It was something else, unexpected, piercing, and loaded with intent. For a few seconds, there was only silence on the other end. His engineer, usually quick to reply, had no immediate answer. The message was simple but powerful. Jamilton had requested a full breakdown of the latest chassis allocations. Not just his, but Leclerc's as well. He had cross-referenced lap data and noticed subtle inconsistencies in vehicle behavior that could not be explained by tire, wear, or fuel loads alone. "I know what I am feeling in the car," he said, "and I know what is being given to me." The engineer tried to maintain composure, but even the most disciplined professionals could not ignore the tension in his voice. This was not a complaint. It was a warning cloaked in calm observation. What truly made the message shocking was the tone. There was no accusation, no raised voice. Just a clinical clarity that made the implications unavoidable. Jamilton was no longer interested in assumptions or excuses. He was dealing in data and drawing conclusions that few inside the garage dared to admit. His engineer, momentarily stunned, responded with a rehearsed line about setup variations and experimentation. But Jamilton had already moved on. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Behind the scenes, the message triggered a quiet storm. Conversations that once lived in whispers began surfacing in debriefs. Could it be true that different components were subtly being prioritized for Leclerc? Was it just a matter of logistics, or was it a reflection of deeper bias within the team? The engineers, analysts, and even junior mechanics began questioning procedures that had once seemed routine. When a 7-time world champion points out a pattern, you do not ignore it, you investigate it. As the simulator session ended and Lewis Jamilton quietly stepped out of the cockpit, a strange atmosphere lingered in the engineering room. His comment, calm, precise, and undeniably deliberate, had acted like a scalpel, slicing open a wound that many in Ferrari had either ignored or denied. The telemetry logs he requested were soon printed, analyzed, and passed from one senior engineer to another, not because they revealed something dramatic at first glance, but because Jamilton had seen something they had not. Or worse, had chosen not to see. That evening, a private technical meeting was hastily organized behind closed doors. Notably, Jamilton was not invited. Neither was Leclerc. The discussion centered on the recent upgrades applied to the front suspension geometry and floor structure. Specifically, why the latest lightweight components, manufactured in limited quantities, had consistently ended up on Leclerc's side of the garage. One senior mechanic quietly admitted that the distribution was not random. He explained that the performance team had made a choice based on Leclerc's feedback being more aligned with the car's development direction. This phrase, innocuous on the surface, was a bombshell. In reality, it meant that Leclerc had been the silent driver of Ferrari's upgrade pathway all along, shaping decisions that should have been balanced between both drivers. And while Jamilton had complied, adapted, and delivered valuable data even when the car's behavior contradicted expectations, it was clear now that his input had not been weighted equally. His unexpected message, therefore, had not only rattled his engineer, it had exposed a hierarchy of trust within the team. Outside the technical rooms, the dynamic between both drivers remained professional on the surface, but subtle changes were now visible. Jamilton was spending more time with his personal performance coach and his own data analysts, stepping away from joint briefings. He was still the first to arrive at the garage and the last to leave, yet the warmth that once existed between the two sides of the garage had cooled. Every setup note, every radio exchange, now carried an extra layer of meaning, measured not just by what was said, but by what was left unsaid. The engineer who had gone speechless earlier was now visibly more cautious. He double-checked every number, every parameter, and cross-validated data that, before Jamilton's comment, would have been passed on without question. There was a growing sense that the margin for bias had vanished, and for the first time, Ferrari's technical core was being held to account. Not by a team principal, but by a driver who had seen through the fog. What made Lewis Jamilton's message truly remarkable was not its content, but its timing. Coming in the heart of a crucial development phase for Ferrari, it disrupted a carefully choreographed progression that had favored predictability over transparency. With teams across the paddock deploying stealth updates and chasing milliseconds through every component, internal harmony was assumed to be a non-negotiable asset. But Jamilton had long believed that harmony built on silence is fragile and ultimately useless. His carefully worded intervention was a strike against that illusion. It was not merely a call for fairness. It was a challenge to the system that pretended to be neutral. Internally, the team's reaction was split. A faction of senior engineers, those who had worked with Jamilton in earlier simulator programs or during wind tunnel validation sessions, quietly supported his position. They had noticed that his feedback was often more detailed, less emotionally charged, and more focused on identifying patterns. In fact, during winter testing in Barcelona, it had been Jamilton's notes that predicted an imbalance in rear stability that caught LECLER by surprise during early long runs. Yet, when upgrade components were introduced, the validation runs were repeatedly assigned to LECLER, as if his feel for the car defined the direction of progress. The implications of Jamilton's request now went far beyond one simulator session. Questions emerged around resource allocation. Why were some batches of experimental floor designs tested exclusively on one chassis? Why were new suspension elements bolted onto LECLER's car for first feedback, while Jamilton was given the reference configuration? A few brave voices began to ask, was Ferrari inadvertently narrowing its perspective by centering one driver over the other? Meanwhile, Jamilton, fully aware of the unease he had sparked, maintained a composed front. He made no public statements. He did not leak his concerns to the media. Instead, he doubled down on preparation. He spent extra hours reviewing overlay data comparing both drivers' inputs in identical corners. He worked with his own simulation specialist to recreate scenarios in which his car's behavior deviated from its predicted performance curve. And he noted everything meticulously. This was not paranoia, this was precision. One evening, when asked by a junior performance engineer why he was taking such a detailed approach, Jamilton responded with quiet conviction. If I am going to drive a compromised car, I am at least going to understand every single way it is compromised. The comment was not bitter. It was not emotional. It was scientific. And it left that young engineer walking away in stunned silence. Not because he disagreed, but because he realized he had no argument. As the situation evolved within the Ferrari garage, the ripple effects of Lewis Jamilton's subtle but seismic message began reaching the upper echelons of the organization. Senior figures in the technical department, those usually insulated from driver-level tensions, were now forced to acknowledge a truth that had long been buried under polished statements and rehearsed optimism. Data does not lie. And what the data revealed, once dissected with Jamilton's probing methodology, was a troubling consistency. Marginal performance deficits, traceable to minor component allocations, build variances, and even software configurations, all seemed to converge on a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. In a private debrief, one of Ferrari's aerodynamicists quietly admitted to colleagues that in at least 2 occasions, high-efficiency rear-wing prototypes had been reserved for LECLER without explanation. On paper, the reasoning was linked to priority testing cycles. In practice, it reflected an internal ranking that few dared to challenge. When one engineer suggested that Jamilton's consistency and broader mechanical sensitivity should grant him equal access to early test parts, the idea was met with polite nods and quickly buried. Yet Jamilton did not push back through confrontation. Instead, he escalated through clarity. He requested a breakdown of part fatigue rates over the last 4 months. He asked why certain data sets were omitted from shared debriefs. And most surprisingly, he questioned whether the artificial intelligence systems used for predictive setup generation were being calibrated using both drivers' styles, or just one. It was a technical question with political weight, and it hit its target. The systems in question, developed in part through partnerships with data firms in Medina, had been trained predominantly on LECLER's telemetry due to his longer tenure with the team. This admission sent shockwaves through the engineering room. Behind closed doors, the quiet war between equality and favoritism intensified. Engineers, now torn between loyalty and objectivity, found themselves in tense discussions about protocol. A junior data analyst confessed that he had stopped flagging inconsistencies in simulation output because it did not align with the direction set by the lead driver. That one phrase, the lead driver, stung more than any public statement. It confirmed what Jamilton had suspected, that despite his legendary status, he was being treated as a supporting act in a team that claimed to have no hierarchy. Still, Jamiltón remained methodical. No outburst. No leaks. Just focus. He took to the simulator with renewed purpose, collaborating with a small, trusted group of engineers to develop alternative setup profiles that better suited his driving inputs. The improvements were measurable. Small gains in stability under braking, cleaner exits on traction zones, and better thermal retention in long-distance simulations. Quietly, and without approval, he was crafting his own development path. By late May, whispers had become unavoidable murmurs. Inside the Ferrari compound, a cultural fault line was exposed, one that split the team between tradition and truth. For years, the red team had operated under the illusion of symmetrical treatment: equal machinery, equal data, and equal chances. But Lewis Jamiltón's calm but unrelenting pursuit of clarity had shattered that narrative. Every graph, every performance overlay, and every component audit he initiated was not a protest, it was evidence. And for a sport where fractions of a second define legacies, the margins he uncovered were not only real, but consequential. Internally, there was a noticeable shift. A growing number of mechanics began taking their cue from Jamiltón's professionalism. Some even started double-checking part allocations before final fitments, a step they had not bothered with before. One experienced technician, known for his loyalty to LECLER, was overheard telling a colleague, "He is not wrong. We got too comfortable assuming one style fits all." That admission, humble and private, marked a turning point. It was no longer just about driver preference, it was about team accountability. Meanwhile, Jamiltón continued to build something even more dangerous than dissent: momentum. In private simulations, his revised setup proposals began producing lap time deltas that were difficult to ignore. Even with the older spec rear wing and the heavier brake ducts that had been assigned to him in earlier tests, he managed to extract balance where imbalance had ruled. His throttle traces were smoother, his steering input more consistent. The numbers spoke for themselves, and they were beginning to speak louder than politics. The media had not caught on yet. On the surface, all seemed calm. Press conferences, sponsor events, and social media posts all followed the usual script. But behind that calm, Jamiltón was constructing a performance-based argument that, once public, could not be dismissed as emotion or ego. He was not demanding number one status. He was simply exposing a system that claimed to be equal, but operated on silent bias. At one point during a strategy review session, Jamiltón asked a simple question. When did we stop using data to make decisions, and start using decisions to choose which data we believe? The room fell silent. No answer came, because there was no honest answer that would not incriminate the very foundations of the team's operational model. And in that silence, Jamiltón found power. Not the kind measured in press quotes or team orders, but the kind that comes from truth supported by numbers, integrity backed by consistency, and a legacy too vast to ignore. Ferrari had signed a champion. What they were now learning was that champions do not just drive fast. They force everyone around them to question whether they have been doing things right, or merely doing things the way they always have. What unfolded next was not a rebellion, but a recalibration. The engineers who once operated with passive obedience began reviewing protocols with fresh eyes. The influence of Lewis Jamiltón was no longer confined to the cockpit or simulator. It had penetrated meetings, spreadsheets, and the subconscious routines of the entire Ferrari operation. He had not shouted. He had not accused. But his presence alone had rewritten the moral code inside the garage. Slowly, the mechanics who once saved the sharpest upgrades for LECLER began to hesitate. Not from fear, but from awareness. Awareness that every silent decision, every unchallenged assumption, was now under the scrutiny of someone who knew exactly what to look for. One of the most telling moments came during a tire compound test simulation at the Maranello facility. Both drivers were scheduled to run identical programs. However, LECLER was given a newer spec suspension linkage, justified as slightly stiffer, but within the same tolerances. Jamiltón, having reviewed previous data, knew better. He requested a reweighing of the assembly and pointed out a 7-gram difference on the front right. The lead technician was stunned. "No one else would notice that," he muttered. Jamiltón replied, "That is the difference between trusting the system and understanding it." It was not a dramatic confrontation, but the weight of that comment echoed. Later that day, the technical director ordered a full audit of recent component batches. Several discrepancies surfaced. Nothing illegal, but certainly enough to justify Jamiltón's suspicions. The public might never hear of these details, but internally, a shift had begun. Fairness was no longer an assumption, it was a requirement. What made Jamiltón's campaign so effective was that it was rooted not in self-interest, but in process. He did not seek to displace LECLER, nor did he ask for favoritism. He simply demanded parity, and made it impossible for anyone to deny when parity was absent. Over time, his requests began to set the standard. When he asked for brake temperature overlays to include ambient humidity readings, that became the new normal. When he flagged telemetry anomalies during corner exit at low-speed chicanes, the engineers rewrote their data filters. What began as isolated vigilance turned into team-wide best practice. Meanwhile, LECLER found himself under unexpected pressure. Not from Jamiltón, but from the growing transparency within the team. Without preferential treatment masking marginal differences, every performance element was now under the same spotlight. For the first time in years, he was being measured not just as Ferrari's lead hope, but as one half of a fully balanced equation. And in that environment, only one thing mattered: results born from equality, not illusion. Jamiltón had not only exposed a flaw, he had raised the standard for what elite teamwork should look like. Let me know when. As June loomed on the horizon, the full effect of Lewis Jamiltón's influence within Ferrari could no longer be denied. What had begun as a quiet inquiry into fairness had evolved into a total cultural reawakening. Systems once operated on the inertia of assumption were now questioned at every turn. Engineers found themselves designing not only for speed, but for truth. And the mechanics, many of whom had long internalized the hierarchy without ever labeling it as such, were now realigning their instincts. They no longer asked, who is the lead driver? But instead, what does the data say? This new way of working unsettled many, particularly those whose comfort had grown from predictability. LECLER, once the unquestioned center of Ferrari's technical narrative, now faced a teammate whose demands for parity inadvertently forced his own performances into a clearer spotlight. The protection he once received, so subtle it was almost invisible, had been stripped back layer by layer. What remained was an unfiltered truth, one that revealed how much of the prior narrative had been shaped not by dominance, but by design. Privately, team leadership struggled with the duality. On one hand, they could not ignore that Jamiltón was driving the team toward operational excellence. On the other, acknowledging his concerns openly would mean confessing that their famed two-driver equality model had always been conditional. And yet, the numbers were becoming too obvious to bury. In post-session debriefs, it was now Jamiltón's lines through Sector 2 that analysts praised. His tire degradation trends were the ones used in simulations. His feedback, not louder but sharper, had started to influence car development pathways, not just balance tweaks. But beyond the technical impact, there was something deeper happening: the return of accountability. Jamiltón's insistence on transparency was contagious. Mid-level engineers who once accepted unexplained part variations began speaking up. Sim data discrepancies that had once been brushed aside were now investigated. Even the simulator team, traditionally siloed from garage politics, found themselves aligning their input protocols with his driving profile, just to ensure their findings could stand up to his scrutiny. In the background, fans and pundits still saw a calm Ferrari surface. But the real story was unfolding in spreadsheets, in part logs, and in honest conversations between teammates who had grown tired of pretending that fairness and favoritism could coexist. And in this shift, Jamiltón was not just changing how cars were prepared. He was redefining what it meant to be part of a truly competitive team. Not one where equality was proclaimed in press releases, but one where it was demanded, proven, and upheld on every screen, in every garage, every day. By the end of May, the transformation was undeniable. Lewis Jamiltón had done more than adjust to life at Ferrari. He had confronted its traditions, unsettled its structure, and without ever issuing an ultimatum, forced it to evolve. His impact reached far beyond the telemetry screens or engineering rooms. It was philosophical. In a sport that often disguises inequality as strategy, he had peeled back the layers, exposing where loyalty had masked laziness and where favoritism had become so normalized it was invisible. And he had done so without grandstanding, only with data, detail, and dignity. The technical shift was measurable. Where once the garage split its attention unevenly between LECLER and Jamiltón, now resources were distributed based on performance trends, not reputations. The latest updates to the floor assembly, previously funneled almost instinctively to LECLER, were now rotated for direct comparison. The engineers no longer worked to support a favorite. They worked to support the fastest, the most consistent, the one whose feedback aligned with what the sensors already knew. And more often than not, that was Jamiltón. Within the team, this shift was both empowering and uncomfortable. For those who had grown used to unspoken hierarchies, Jamiltón's presence became a mirror. One that showed where shortcuts had been taken, where bias had shaped outcomes, and where true merit had been suppressed in the name of order. But for the younger generation inside Ferrari, the interns, the simulation engineers, the new hires, he represented a new archetype. Not just a champion, but a reformer. Not loud, but unyielding. Not political, but precise. Outside the paddock, the press had begun to catch on. Headlines grew bolder. Is Ferrari finally treating its drivers equally? Asked one. Jamiltón's quiet revolution, read another. public sentiment began to shift. Fans who had once questioned why the seven-time world champion had joined a team stuck in tradition now saw the answer. Because real greatness does not run from challenges, it dismantles them. And Leclerc? He was still fast, still passionate, still adored by the Tifosi. But now, he faced a reality he had not known before. One where excuses held no weight, and performances could not lean on institutional favoritism. He was still in the fight, but for the first time it was on equal footing. In the end, Lewis Jamilton's mission was never to expose anyone. It was to elevate everything. And in doing so, he reminded the entire paddock that excellence, when unshackled by politics and protected by transparency, is not only possible, it is unstoppable.